New data from the U.S. Census is signaling a shift in political power as more people move to traditionally red states from blue ones. Texas, North Carolina, and Florida are among several states that saw growth in their populations and will gain congressional districts. And New York, Illinois, and California are some states that will lose seats. Focus now shifts to how states will redraw their districts ahead of next year's midterm elections. For more, I'm joined now by CBS News Director of Elections and Surveys, Anthony Salvanto. All right, Anthony, if I'm talking to you, that means we are fast on the approach to the next election cycle. Really good to see you. First, can you explain how does this process work? How exactly do states get districts?
Hey, great to talk to you, Elaine. And you're right. You can think of this as kind of the first part of that midterm election cycle, because what's happening here is they're determining how many congressional districts each state will get when we start talking about those midterms in 2022. The way this works is that once the census is complete and they've got what they think is a good count of the number of people in each state, then every state by the Constitution gets at least one seat in the House of Representatives, and then they go around and start giving out the rest of them. There's a formula that proportions them out as they allocate them, and it goes around almost like a little bit like a deck of cards, but you're giving out congressional districts. And what you see on the map, as you explained at the top, Elaine, is that relative to each other, the faster growing states, Texas, Florida, North Carolina, and some in the West, Colorado, Oregon, and Montana, have gained seats because they've been relatively faster growing, and now their populations are rising. California, its population also went up, but not as fast. That loses a seat. And then there's all this concentration of states here in the Northeast, and you've got losses there for them of one congressional district: New York, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, and all of that. Look, bottom line is folks who've been watching us and they watch the Electoral College map, they watch the congressional districts, you know that these are traditionally either battleground or blue states, often won by Democrats. And so those seats lose, and those states losing population as people move to the South and the West, Elaine.
Anthony, were any of these new allocations a surprise?
I think to a lot of people, some were. And it sort of goes both ways politically, because some folks thought that more northeastern states might lose more districts. People thought maybe New York would lose more. Turns out they were actually close to keeping all their delegation, their districts. And people thought that maybe Arizona would get another one. Maybe Florida would get two more. I think you'll see people a little bit surprised by that. We don't yet know what the breakdowns are of the kinds of populations in each of these states. Those census numbers will come out later this summer. And that's going to be really interesting to watch, especially because a lot of these states, Texas, Florida, and Arizona, as I mentioned, we know have sizable Latino populations. So we'll be really interested to see what those proportions the census thinks are there in all of those states as well, Elaine.
So, Anthony, we don't know yet the demographic breakdown of some of these population shifts. Does that mean, is it too early to tell right now what some of the implications this could have on next year's midterm elections? Does it benefit one political party over the other, or is it just too soon to tell right now?
Yeah, great question, because what happens next is redistricting, and that's a word people are going to, get used to hearing, because now that the states know how many districts they have, now state by state, they're going to draw those district lines. And what'll happen, Elaine, is that you're going to see big fights over where those lines ought to be drawn, and you're going to hear a lot about who controls that process. So, for example, in Texas, here I'll circle it in red, in places like Texas, in Florida, the Republicans and the legislature and the governor will control that redistricting process. That could benefit the Republicans if they draw districts, those two new ones and others, that benefit Republican candidates. Whereas there are places that the Democrats, even though they've lost seats, in places like Illinois, they'll control the redistricting process. Some places like Colorado will have an independent commission that will do it. So it's really going to depend on what kinds of ways that the parties who control the process now can and do divide up those lines. And divide up, you'll hear the term gerrymandering sometimes, pejoratively, of course, but it's that redistricting process that comes next, and that's where we'll go next in the fight over all of this, Elaine.
So what impact could redistricting have on the 2024 Electoral College?
Well, now you see when I talked about how things were shifting to the South and the West, what you've got is, if you took the map now that Joe Biden, say, got 306 electoral votes, right? If you took that same map and you applied the states that he won, he would go from 306 to 303 electoral votes. And that's a way to just illustrate, that doesn't mean that's what's going to happen next time, but that's a way to illustrate the fact that some of the Electoral College power has shifted towards Republican states. On the other hand, we know that as these states are growing and changing, they might be moving towards competitiveness, right? The Democrats have had their eyes on winning Texas for a long time. They haven't quite gotten there, but they may try that again, and now that's got, 40 electoral votes, so it's an even bigger prize. Oregon, Colorado, also states that Democrats traditionally have done well in. So there's a balance here. There's a balance here. But what is clear is that the Electoral College power not only is shifting south and west, Elaine, but also we could see an even greater gap between the number of electoral votes that a winner gets and the popular vote, as that proportion could get even more different.
So, Anthony, I'm curious, how could this data potentially affect your polling in the future?
Oh, that's a great question, because when we do polling, we make sure that every state is represented in proportion to its size in the country when we do, say, a national poll. So with the census numbers, those are often a benchmark that we use in polls to make sure that we've got the right proportions. As those census numbers change, we change our allocations, we change our weighting. But when we get to the new congressional districts and we start talking about competitive races in CDs, it's going to get really tricky, because now you're going to have to figure out what the demographics and what the past votes are in the new congressional districts. And you may have to go block by block, precinct by precinct, to figure that out, to try to get a handle on who might be competitive in some of those new CDs, because it'll be a whole new ballgame, Elaine.
All right, many more storylines to come. Anthony Salvanto, wonderful to see you and your map again. Thank you so much, Anthony. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.